At least 1 in 7 South Africans will experience a traumatic event in their lifetime. If left untreated, this places them at high risk of developing acute stress and more serious long-term mental illness. As we approach Mental Health Day, we discuss how a traumatic event can lead to acute stress disorder and how this differs from post-traumatic stress disorder. To help us understand it all is Dr. Yumna Minty, a member of the South African Society of Psychiatrists. Thank you for your patience with us. What is trauma? How do I know I'm traumatized?
Hi, good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity. So in recognition of World Mental Health Day, which occurs this month, SASOP, or the South African Society of Psychiatrists, has chosen to focus on and raise awareness around an acute stress disorder, which is a recognizable and diagnosable psychiatric condition. And I think this is particularly pertinent for us as South Africans, because if you think about it, we have extremely high rates of trauma within our country. So, I mean, we have high rates of violent crimes, high rates of interpersonal violence, gender-based violence, and more recently, we've had large-scale traumatic events. So things like the political unrest and the more recent floods that occurred this year in KZN. South Africans are exposed to trauma on a regular basis and a daily basis. And one of the recognizable conditions that may arise from trauma is what is known as an acute stress disorder. Essentially, to break this down, what happens is that an individual experiences a trauma. It doesn't only have to be the victim of the trauma who is at risk from an acute stress disorder. What we now know is that individuals who, for example, witness somebody else experiencing a trauma or hear about a close one or a loved one who has experienced a traumatic event, or by virtue of their occupation, certain populations of people are at higher risk of repetitive or cumulative exposures to trauma. So, for example, police officers who are on duty, or first responders, or paramedics, or even journalists who are covering large-scale traumatic events. All of these people are exposed to trauma, which then, within the month after the traumatic event, then leads to certain signs of psychological and emotional distress, which can significantly affect their functioning and have significant and dire consequences for them, as well as their families, as well as occupationally and economically going forward.
So when we take a look at the cause being trauma that leads to acute stress disorder, how do we stop it from getting there, right? So how do you get diagnosed? Is there a diagnosis to say, well, I've been traumatized? How do I even know that I've been traumatized, right? Because we can very well argue that for a majority of people in this country, trauma is just part of life, right? So it's like, what? You're traumatized by what? It's just another shooting, or it's just another whatever it is, right? So how do you get diagnosed? Who diagnoses you?
I think you raise an important point, in the sense that we like to think of ourselves as South Africans as resilient, because, like you said, we experience so many traumatic events. But I think the first step towards recognizing that you have an acute stress disorder is obviously recognition of the symptoms. So being able to recognize what you are experiencing and that it is not normal and that it is affecting your functioning. So raising awareness around this. Because if you aren't aware of what you're going through and that it's not normal, you are then unlikely to seek help or to seek assistance. So some of the signs that an individual may experience after a traumatic event are things like difficulties with their memory and their concentration. So if you think about it, this affects their work functioning and their work performance. They can have difficulties with their mood, so they can be quite sad or depressed. Feel quite worthless and hopeless. They can be irritable. If you think about it, this affects their relationships with their loved ones and makes it even much harder to access support from people around them, because they're sort of pushing people away. It can decrease their ability to experience positive emotions, so things like excitement or happiness or enthusiasm. And then also these individuals experience what we call intrusive symptoms or flashbacks. So over time, they continue to re-experience these traumatic circumstances as if they are happening in the moment. And they also experience what we call hyperarousal. So they are constantly in this sort of super vigilant state where they can't switch off, and they almost waiting for something bad to happen. It affects their sleep, and then that then has a knock-on effect in terms of their functioning. And the end result of all of this is that this particular individual then struggles to function in a variety of spheres. So they may not be able to cope at work. leading to difficulties at work, so like disciplinary hearings or work performance issues. They may not be able to cope in terms of their family relationships. So a mum or a dad who has family to look after may struggle in those roles. And like I said, it makes it difficult for them to access support and maintain their own personal mental health and level of functioning.
Doc, before we let you go, are we a help-seeking society? So do you find that people take up the opportunity to visit a psychologist, a psychiatrist, or, like you said, have we normalized the not-so-normal?
I think that we have a lot of challenges that prevent the large majority of South Africans from seeking assistance. And one of this is, like I said, we believe that it's okay, and we believe that life will go on, and, you know, we're sort of resilient. I think because we're so exposed to trauma on a daily basis, we kind of just sort of brush it aside and think that we'll go on. Notwithstanding that, I mean, we have difficulties in terms of our healthcare system and the amount of psychiatrists and psychologists that are available, you know, to see patients. So I think for a lot of reasons, it is difficult for people to access help, but trying to raise awareness around this and trying to raise awareness that it doesn't have to be, your first port of call doesn't have to be a mental health care professional, but, you know, somebody in your community. So if you are experiencing symptoms, you know, somebody that you trust, or a religious leader, a church leader, a lay counselor, somebody who is informed and emotionally receptive, and somebody who's empathic and can guide you in the right sort of direction is perhaps a starting point as well.
Dr. Yumna Minty is with the South African Society of Psychiatrists. Thank you, Doc. Ms. Dumi Khaswe is standing by with all things sport in a few moments.